I'm Valerie Hickey, and I'm the head of Environment, Natural Resources and the Ocean at the World Bank. And I have the absolute pleasure to sit down and have a cup of coffee with one of Antonio Guterres' advisors, youth advisors on climate change. We talk about biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and how we go from Sharm el-Sheikh to Montreal, from the climate COP to the biodiversity COP, and keep momentum going to make sure we can integrate development, climate, and nature.
I'm Archana Soreng and I'm from India. I come from Khariya tribe and I'm a researcher and I'm one of the 7 members of UN Secretary General on climate change, and I'm so happy to be here interacting with you and in COP27. And I truly believe, and I have been advocating to Secretary General also, that we need intersectional approach on climate action and biodiversity conservation. It cannot and no longer be seen as separate entities and separate policies, because back home in national policies and on ground, it's all about the same people, same land, same forest and communities, and the policies needs to be embedded together, integrated together, and we need intersectional approach. And that's why we need to stand in solidarity with all the constituency, even if there is different formal processes.
We're all in this together. Do you like being a champion?
Yeah, I think I like it, because for me, what I'm also observing these days, young people and especially young girls and women from my place looking up to me and giving me a lot of messages makes me feel very realize what I'm doing, because for them it was like never ever the dream that someone from our community can go to UN and access these spaces. So that's also been a strong sense of responsibility to engage and fight hard. And that's why for me I have also been saying that climate action is also reclaiming spaces.
Yes, completely. I've always said, I heard this from another young person at the UN General Assembly, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think young people must feel like that, because we're making all of these decisions here. And it's not just for the future of young people, but for it's your present. Can you keep going to school, or is your school going to be flooded out, so you're going to end up not being able to learn anything for the next year? It's about now, it's about the future. But that's why it's so lovely to see the pavilion, the Children and Youth Pavilion, have a space for people to come here and talk. I think it's fantastic.
And this pavilion has been so powerful, because I was like, the events which we had, and also the the coloring, painting and the art and all of the people, it's like if you have no engagement, you come and sit and interact or how you're feeling, and it's been very powerful.
Do you have a really active community, all of the ambassadors, the UN youth ambassadors? Do you guys get together a lot? Do you share experiences? Is it a real sort of coalition of the hardworking?
So I think for us as 7 members of UN Secretary General, we have been really come close in these 2 years, because what I've seen is we all come from different regions. But what is really important is we all have same belief system and a willingness to work, because we all have different thematics also. Like one of my colleague is lawyer, I'm a researcher, one has finance, one is community mobilization.
And you're all about nature-based solutions, right?
Yeah, so it's all about nature-based solutions. So for me, I'm about rights of indigenous people and local communities and climate action. So even for nature-based solution, I feel it's really important to emphasize on good side of nature-based solution, and it's also important to recognize the challenges which nature-based solutions are.
Because what are the challenges that you see?
On ground, if we see nature-based solution, at times nature-based solution is also pitched as alternatives to emission reduction, which I feel is really problematic. The second thing is, when we are talking about nature-based solution, I say that it has to be with free, prior, informed consent of indigenous people and local communities.
And those stakeholder engagement has to be meaningful.
Exactly, because not doing that is leading to further marginalization of communities on ground, because the plantation which is happening on ground in terms of afforestation programs often leads to more vulnerable to the communities, because it is done in their agriculture lands.
But this is where I sometimes think we're using nature-based solutions as a Trojan horse for other agendas. To do conservation in a way that doesn't include co-management, doesn't include stakeholder engagement, isn't co-created with the communities whose lands these are. Whether they're traditional lands, whether they're currently community owned and managed, these are not the lands of other people, they're your lands. You have to be at the table talking about their use.
Exactly, very rightly said. And that's why I often feel that, indigenous people, local communities, and young people should be leaders of climate action, not victims of climate policies.
No, it's hard. I have to tell you, I admire what you're doing. And I have to say here, this was the first COP where I was so glad we actually had a biodiversity day. And we had honest conversation around nature-based solutions and what's working, what's not. I was on a great panel yesterday with Niatero, the big Indigenous peoples representative organization, just talking to Jennifer about why it is that a lot of the lands we're talking about, these are stolen lands. And we have to take a moment to consider what that means. And we can't just talk about deforestation as if all that matters is the trees, but it's the cultural landscape, it's the owned landscape around it that has been taken too. You're a big land rights person, yeah? It's the solution, isn't it? If we got land rights fixed, would everything else get fixed?
I feel and I believe in that, because the place where I come and from the communities where we come from, the indigenous people and local communities across the globe, it's like if our land rights is not there, then we are living under the threat of eviction, displacement, migration, and then this is leading to loss of our traditional language, loss of our traditional knowledge, and it is like curtailing us to continue our traditional knowledge and forest-based community-led forest protection practices. So I feel land rights, it's really critical to make us safe, keep us safe, and also more so have a sustained livelihood.
And because you'll invest in land that you own, that you know you're never going to be kicked off, you're going to invest in it. If you're worried that tomorrow you're going to be kicked off, why are you going to invest in it and mind it and take care of it when it could be somebody else's tomorrow?
Exactly. And also another thing which I feel is like often there has been this thing that, give your land, will give you money and will give you compensation and job, and I feel money and job will end at one point of time, but our land with us is sustainable.
It's an asset.
Yes.
I'm Irish and we very much have a connection to the land where it is our land, it's who we are as a people, and because of the history of colonialism, it's very much around you can't give your land up. The land is the last thing that connects us to who we are, connects us to our ancestors and to our family and to our future. And it's a very interesting way of looking at the world. And sometimes I feel it, COPs and negotiate, we forget that. We forget that it's not all about money. It's not all about these sorts of things. Sometimes it's about what it feels like. It's about who we are as a people. It's about not humiliating us as a people and taking the one thing that connects us to our ancestors.
Yeah, and that's why I would also like to connect it from the climate space, that's why I feel loss and damage finance is the bare minimum and it's the priority and very integral to have. But that's where we are negotiating to and fro on it, which I feel at times very sad, because literally we are facing the impacts of climate crisis. We are losing our land, forests and territories, and more so under the threat of extinction ourselves across the world.
But how do you, this is always, I think, the challenge with loss and damage. So I'm based in the US in Washington, and 11% of Americans live in poverty. So it's almost 39 million people. It's always a difficult conversation to talk about loss and damage in other countries and paying when people in the United States are struggling to have schools that work. They themselves aren't always have access to clean water. They have crumbling infrastructure. They live in food deserts. I think one of the challenges around loss and damage is because climate change is happening everywhere, and sadly there are poor people everywhere, it's not always so easy to think about it as a global north, global south problem. We're all in this together, and poor people, whether they live in the global north or the global south, are at the end of the line when it comes to getting support from anybody, aren't they?
Yeah, I think it's really critical, but I also feel like it's really important to see that when we are talking about impacts of climate crisis and in living in the adversity situation, it's also like who has been living under the adversity for a longer period of time and how things have been in terms of critical. So I think it needs to come from a collective effort where we are acknowledging it and acknowledging the need, because at times it is also like, denial that we don't need it. So I think it needs to be acceptance of this and work together to navigate
Isn't that
this.
the first pillar of climate justice, just recognition?
Yes.
The fact that there are people suffering more and suffering longer, and at least we need to recognize that, put them at the table, make sure they have a role in decision making.
Yes, and that's what I feel that when we are talking about also, decision making spaces and meaningful leadership, I think often it's also recognizing that, like, for example, if we want more and more indigenous people to be in the decision making spaces, how do we address the challenges on ground, like which is eviction, displacement, impacts of climate crisis? Because if that is not addressed, then they will not be able to speak up and they will not be able to engage in the spaces. So I think addressing the core issues is also one way of meaningful leadership. The second thing which I truly feel is about identifying young people and leaders on ground, because we have enormous young people on ground who are working on climate action, and that's why I feel language plays a really important role, because we need to make sure these policies are translated in different languages and accessible to communities.
It's such a simple thing, but it's so critical for accessibility.
Exactly.
Who are your heroes in this space? When you look around, who do you say, that's who I want to be when I grow up?
In the climate space, I have not, idolized anything. For me, it's mostly about my ancestors and my elders in the indigenous communities, and more so all the indigenous leaders from across the globe who are in the climate spaces, not one of them but everyone, because I truly believe everyone brings so much to this space from their experience, and I personally have learned so much from them, because I feel it's because they advocated. We have now in the
They've
IPCC
made a space for you.
Exactly.
That's fabulous.
We have in the IPCC report now about rights of indigenous people and local communities over the land, forests and territories. We have about supporting traditional knowledge and practices. So that's what I look up to them, and I really look up to Secretary General of United Nations, because as a UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, one thing I really liked about this leadership of Secretary General is like to have an open and free and frank space where we can speak truth to the power and leadership.
So you really can talk to Antonio Guterres and say, this is what it needs to be about. We have to have land rights on the table. We have to have indigenous people on it. And he listens.
Yes, he listens. And we can be critical to him. We can be positive to him. But what's important, he listens and he acts on it. And that's something which I feel like we need more from the world leaders across.
When you were growing up, when you were small, did you think you would be sitting with Antonio Guterres, being his advisor? That's so awesome.
I never ever imagined in my life that I'll be in this space. But what I feel and what I realized after reflection is that it's not only like the ambition of that I want to become there, I want to reach there and start working. It's all about, advocating and believing for what you believe in the issues and impact. And then the life takes you to the places where you are meant to be.
So what's success for you? So 30 years from now, when you're the Secretary General of the UN, what's success going to look like? What do you want to make sure that COP 47, are we going to be having the same discussions? Is it going to be different?
First of all, I think we should not have COP 47 because I think we really need to make sure that all the policies are done and we are working on implementation, because Paris Agreement in 2015 has laid it down very strongly.
Right. Let's just get to work and get it done.
And for me, what does success means and what I would like to look up to is like, I would look up to see that every countries or almost 90% of the countries in their NDCs have incorporated rights of indigenous people over land, forests and territories, supporting traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous people and local communities, and ensuring youth as an integral stakeholders and implementation of meaningful leadership and capacity building and supporting young people in their NDCs.
That gets a cheers. Amen to that one. I love it.